Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video I'll be doing another Survivor What If video, this time talking about what if every season had returnee captains. Now I'd like to thank Radio Ranger from my Twitch chat for this video idea, and I do feel like it turned out to be a pretty interesting one here, where essentially the way that this is going to be formatted is essentially what if every season had two returning captains, followed the trend of Survivor Guatemala, where in Survivor Guatemala we had two returning captains with both players coming from the previous season. So here we'll be running through every season of the show and talk about the two people from that cast I think would have been brought back for the following season had this been a reoccurring trend. And with that, let's just get started with Survivor Borneo, which I do think is a bit of a tough one because I think there are a number of routes that I could take here. I mean, there's obviously the Pagongs, who were fan favorites at the time, though I do think a lot of those Pagongs did not really want to play again, with probably the exceptions being Jervis and Jenna, with Jenna probably not being someone super likely to be picked here, while Jervis definitely could have. Though I think the other options here would have been someone like a Richard Hatch, who I don't think they would have wanted to bring back, as I don't think they would have wanted to bring back the previous winner. I don't think Kelly Wigglesworth would have wanted to come back. So at that point, I think we're kind of left with Rudy and Sue as potential returnees. And I think Sue is a lock for this cast in my mind. I do think she would have wanted to come back, and I do think they would have wanted her. The other spot, though, is more of a debate, where again, between Rudy and Jervis, I mean, obviously Rudy was this big fan favorite by the very end, though Jervis was also very liked at that point. And we do see in the Big Brother 2 Survivor special that it is Jervis and Sue that come back for that event. Though I do feel like for Survivor, I do think they'll go with Rudy. Again, Rudy was his big fan favorite at the time. I think also just thematically, it makes more sense to have Rudy and Sue there than Sue and Jervis. So I did go with Rudy here. Now for season 2, and this one can be a bit tough as well, where I think on paper you would think the pick here would be Colby and Jerry as the two rivals and two of the biggest names at that point in Survivor. However, one, I don't know how likely Colby would have been to play again right away, especially when he was trying to start an acting career. And even beyond that, I do think there's a certain other route that I could see Survivor going in a lot more, especially if we're talking about immediately after Australian Outback, which is the return of Scoopin'. And obviously there's a lot of things to say about Scoopin' nowadays, but again, if we're taking ourselves back to this time, one of the major stories from this season was Scoopin's medevac and the what if, to where I feel like Scoopin' is a lock here. I feel like they definitely would have wanted Scoopin' back because of that storyline. The question is, who is he with? And I think there are two options. I think it is, again, Varner, which, again, also not the greatest stuff to say about him now, or Roger, which I think Roger's a more palatable presence, especially at the time. And to be honest, I do think they go with Roger. Now, we have heard host show that supposedly there was a point where they were considering a captain season with Scoopin' and Roger, which, I mean, I will say this could seem a little bit random, but I mean, considering like supposedly that was a consideration later on, I do feel like why not do it here, especially when both of them were still popular figures within the Survivor community. So because I did go Scoopin' and Roger. Next up for Survivor Africa, and I mean, this one's just super obvious. I mean, there's no question in my mind. It is Lex and Tom. Obviously, they were two of the biggest characters from that season, to where they were likely returnees anyway. But even beyond that, I mean, they obviously had the Final Four scandal where they were supposedly promised all-star appearances due to having gotten screwed over in the Final Four Immunity Challenge. And with that, I mean, why not just do it here then if we're bringing back two people every season? And Lex and Tom here feel like the obvious picks. Next up for MARQUESAS, and here I think this one's also kind of easy based on how production looked at this season. I mean, obviously Kathy I think is a pretty big lock. Obviously she was the big star of the season. She was a big fan favorite. I think there's no denying it would have been Kathy. The other person though is very much up for grabs, though considering what happened on All Stars and considering how we know production feels about this person, I did go with Boston Rob. Now Boston Rob was obviously this big underdog figure throughout a lot of this season. I do think despite his smugness throughout a lot of it, I do feel like a return from him, especially at this point, Survivor was not that unlikely. Now, I will say, I do think picking him over the likes of like a John or even a Sean, who made it further into the game, does feel a bit weird, though I do think if we're simply looking at it from production standpoint, I do think they would have gone for Rob here. Next up for Thailand, and this one's fine because I don't think they would have wanted to pick anybody. I don't think they would have wanted to do this season straight up. However, gotta pick two people, and my initial instinct was to go with Helen Glover here as someone that seemed to be the most likely returnee immediately after the season, though she never truly seemed to be that much in consideration for a future returnee season. So instead, the route I ended up going here is Xian, as obviously she's the only one to delay a return for All-Stars, and was still a pretty big character on the season. And the other one might be a little bit random. However, this is the only other person from Thailand that we know was deep into consideration for a future season, and that person is Ken, because Ken was the alternate for All-Stars for some reason. So I guess he's there. But realistically, I think there is like at least some dynamic to play off of here, where at least Ken and Xian were pretty close on the island. Again, it did seem like production was pretty high on Ken at the time, to where, again, I guess we're picking them. Next up from Amazon, and I'll be honest, I feel like Amazon's very tough as well. I don't feel like there is a super solid answer here, in the fact that I don't get a great sense of how production really felt about most of this cast. I believe they were very happy with the Amazon at the time, and do later repeat the men versus women theme, though in terms of the individual cast members, really none of these people outside the two I pick here end up being true contenders to return for down the road. So because of that, I did end up going with Jenna and Rob. But even here, I don't feel that great about it. Now, Rob obviously was called the smartest player to never win at the time. I do feel like he's someone that was very likely to return. And Jenna obviously did also come back for All-Stars. And straight up, I would have also probably considered Heidi if she wanted to come back, though I believe she never really wanted to. But again, like, I really don't know how production felt about the likes of like Adina and an Alex. I think that would have made the most sense to me, is to bring back those two for a future captain season, though just with the lack of knowledge of how likely they are as returnees, I decided to just go with the standard here of Jenna and Rob, even though I don't think Jenna, being a former winner, would have been that great of a pick here. Again, I went with it either way. Next up, for Survivor Pro Islands. This one's super easy in my eyes. I think there's no other choice here to me for a future captain season to be Fair Play versus Rupert. Essentially this good versus evil battle that I think they could have done a lot with. I think this is definitely the type of matchup that they would hype up in the promos, and really just as a whole, I think they're both super likely returnees at this point. Obviously, Rupert does immediately come back for All-Stars. Fair Play, I think if they knew how big the reaction would be to Fair Play, would have also come back for All-Stars. I do feel like these two are pretty likely picks here. Next up for actual All-Stars, which I will say straight up for All-Star seasons, I didn't go with the most realistic picks here, largely because I don't think most All-Stars would decide to come back immediately afterwards anyway. I think no matter what, I'll be coming out with a mostly unrealistic option. So I decided, screw it. We're going Rob versus Lex here. Obviously, was this happening? No. I don't think Rob was going to ever play Survivor again immediately after All-Stars. Obviously, Lex was pretty burned by this experience, where I don't think he would have wanted to play again either. But again, they're the most notable rivalry from this season, to where it makes full sense for them to be future captains. So we're going with them. Next up for Survivor, Vanuatu, and I think this one's pretty easy in my mind as well. I think there's a very clear rivalry that would have been really fun to see on a future season, and that is Twyla versus Eliza, where at the time, Twyla was a pretty big character and was someone that was in contention to return multiple times after that. Eliza was someone that obviously did come back for Micronesia, and I feel like the person that seems to be left out here is Amy, where I would have very much considered Amy as well, though I do think the Twyla-Eliza rivalry was a bigger storyline, to where I decided to go with them instead here. Now, there's no real point in talking about Palau, as this is literally the entire basis of the video, is that obviously they picked Stephanie and Bobby John. Though with that, we'll move on to Guatemala, where I also picked Stephanie and Bobby John. Where straight up, I don't think production liked Guatemala. I don't think there was anyone here they were particularly excited to bring back. Now I know that they liked Danny, and I know the likes of like a Cindy, a Jamie, a Judd were in the running for Blood versus Water, though I never really got the sense that anyone from Guatemala was really that likely to return for future seasons. So because of that, why not pick Stephanie and Bobby John again? That would have been really funny, so why not? Next up for Panama, and really I feel like there are some big name returnees that you can get from this season. I think it comes down to Suri, Terry, and Shane. The question is though, which of those two do they pick for the following season? And while it probably makes more sense to go Terry and Shane, as at least they're like similar-ish enough archetype wise, I did go Terry and Suri, as really I feel like those two are the most likely returnees coming out of this season. And while they are polar opposites game wise, I do feel like those were the two that I could see production being extremely excited to bring back right away. away, so I did go with them here. Next up for Cook Islands, and this one's a bit tough one because I do think there is an obvious answer here in Yule and Ozzy, and that is essentially my pick here. I think that is the option that is the most interesting for a return. I think it's a situation where while Yule wasn't super likely to play again, I don't think it was completely out of the cards, while Ozzy obviously was very apt to play again, so I did go with that. However, realistically, I don't know if they could have gotten Yule, and I think if they were going for a more realistic option, they probably would have went Penner and Ozzy, as I did think Penner was also obviously very likely to play again, with those probably being the two most likely returnees from this season, so I could see them going that route. Yeah, I think the Yule-Ozzy rivalry is obviously a lot more interesting. Next up for Fiji, and there is no debate in my mind here, it is Dreams and Yao-Man. Now, I think initially you might think it would be Earl and Yao-Man, however, at the time of Survivor Fiji, Earl was not particularly liked by production. Jeff Probst openly called him a really boring winner, and I do not get the sense that they were particularly hyped on bringing Earl back. However, Yao was obviously a locked-in returnee for next returnee season, while also Jeff Probst said that the only thing interesting about this season was the Dreams and Yao-Man situation, to where I think them bringing back Dreams feels like the most likely situation here. Next up for Survivor, China, and this is one that is weird, as obviously we do get two returnees from this season on the following season, in that being Amanda and James, and that is essentially the picks I picked here, though again it does feel a bit weird as they aren't really like true rivals in any true sense, or they aren't even these two people that had that good of a relationship on their first season, though again they were the two returnees that came back for the following season. Now, I did very much debate PG and James, as originally PG was going to be on Micronesia, however she turned it down, and I feel like the PG-James rivalry makes a bit more sense, though considering they couldn't get PG for that, I decided to just go Amanda and stick with what we had anyway. Next up for Micronesia, and this is one where initially the first one that comes to mind is Parvati and Amanda, as obviously they were the final two, were extremely close duo, were both pretty strong players, I think would have been very interesting returnees. However, I think there's another interesting way to bring back returnees from this season that I did go with, and that is bring back to the medevac players here, that being James and Penner, both of which being people that I think were very likely to come back at this point. With James, again, if this was the case, that would mean James was on 3 seasons in a row, which I will say would not surprise me that much at this point in Survivor history. While with Penner, again, Penner was still a very big character, and again, playing into this medevac angle, I feel like these two would have been a very likely pairing here. Next up for Gabon, and this one was a bit tough just because, again, I don't think Gabon's really a season that had that many returning options to begin with. However, I did just go with the two people that ended up returning later, and that being Randy and Sugar, where again, I think this just makes sense. Again, they had a rivalry on the season. They were both people that production wanted to bring back right away. I feel like this is the option. Again, I think outside this, you could think of returnees like a Kenny possibly, a Ace I know was in the running at one point. I would have considered Crystal, but I don't believe Crystal is ever in contention to be brought back. So again, I just feel like Randy and Sugar makes the most sense here. Next up for Survivor Tocantins, and this one has a very obvious answer you think of right away, that being JT and Steven, the two that got to the end, this really strong pairing. However, as much as production seemed to really love JT and Steven, I don't know how likely of a returnee Steven was at this point, particularly over a certain other person, so instead I did go with JT and Coach, as again, there was no doubt that Coach was coming back after this season. Again, like he was pretty much the main talk of this season, to where it just never felt like it was in doubt. And really, it was more so a debate of who the other person is, more so than actually thinking that JT and Steven was an actual option, to where at that point, I think they probably would go JT. JT obviously was very apt to play again. JT was also a fan favorite. Well, I think you can also bring up the likes of a Tyson to potentially go against Coach. I feel like JT was the more likely returnee, so I did go that route. Next up for Survivor, Samoa. And this is one that I think there is a pretty clear answer in my mind. Now, no matter what, it involves Russell Hantz. There's no way they're not going to bring back Russell Hantz. So at that point, it's who is Russell Hantz against? Now, Shambo is someone that I think they very much wanted, though obviously she didn't want to play again. I think Laura is probably the one that makes the most sense from like a pure rivalry standpoint of who they would bring back against Russell. However, I think the real answer here is Russell versus Russell. I think they would have picked Russell Swan. Ozzy just got medevac. Now, I don't know if he necessarily would have been cleared to come back right away, and I've heard that it took a while for him to even convince his wife to allow him to go out, and I don't know if that would have been a situation that he would have been willing to play again right away, though I still think they would have tried to go for the Russell versus Russell battle here. That's essentially good Russell versus bad Russell, and with Russell Swan's obviously medevac story. I think they definitely want him back. So again, that is the route I went here. Next up for heroes versus villains. And I mean, there's no debate, right? They literally did this. It's Rob versus Russell. So that one's pretty easy. Next up for Nicaragua. This one I also think is very easy. Again, there were two people who at the time were very clear returnees, but also two people that were very clear rivals. And that is Jane and Marty. I feel like this was a very clear one here, with their rivalry being one of the biggest storylines of the season, where I feel like they're definitely the pick here. Next up for Redemption Island, where right away, I don't think you would get this, though, considering the fact that they literally brought these two people back as a rivalry for Caramoan. I mean, I gotta go Philip and Francesca. I mean, like, realistically, again, it does feel weird to pick Francesca here for a captain season, though, again, they really shoehorned Francesca into Caramoan, where I think they definitely would have wanted these two together for the following season. Again, if we're only limiting it to this season. Now, South Pacific initially was going to be Philip versus Coach, and obviously that makes a lot more sense. So again, if we're only having it from people from Redemption Island, Philip versus Francesca is probably the route they would have gone with. Next up for South Pacific, and this one I think you have a few options. Now I will say for a second I did consider just saying screw it and doing Coach versus Ozzy again, though I didn't go with that route here. Instead, I do think there are a number of returnees from this season that would have been considered. Again, you got like a Cochran, a Brandon, a Don, Jim. Rice has always been someone that was particularly liked by production. And I do think if we're thinking about this immediately after the season, I think the pair you bring back here is Jim and Cochran. Obviously, Cochran really wanted to play again at the time and does come back for Caramoan, but also had this rivalry / weird alliance with Jim that I think this is the route they would have gone with. Now, I think you can argue that, okay, they really wanted to shoehorn Brandon Hance in there. So again, with how much they loved Jim Rice at the time, I think they would have gone Jim and Cochran instead. Next up for One World, and this one has a very solid answer in my mind. I mean, this is literally a pairing that they hyped up in the preseason for this season. I think they're bringing back Troyzan versus Tarzan, the Battle of the Zans, which was actually a thing. I mean, there's literally promos of this, which is so funny. I think this is the route they would have taken. I think at the time, Troyzan was a very likely returnee. While Tarzan wasn't as much, I do think they would have hyped up this battle here, which would have been humorous. Now, otherwise, I think the other very likely returnee option would have been Colton, though we obviously saw what happened there, where he was initially supposed to be on Philippines the season afterwards, though was taken off supposedly due to the negative reaction to him. I think otherwise you can consider someone like a Cat as someone that was a likely returnee, though I do think the Battle of the Zans just is a funnier storyline, so I did go with that. Next up for Philippines, and here I think the obvious pairing right away is Abby versus RC. I think that would have been funny to see on the following season, though at the same time I don't think it would have happened. We obviously know the story of RC having turned down Cambodia because of the possibility of her being with Abby, so I just really don't think this was ever going to happen. So instead I just went with the other obvious one, in that being Denise and Malcolm, where obviously we do see Malcolm literally come back for the following season, while Denise wasn't someone that I would have expected to say yes right away. I do think this is probably the pairing that makes the most sense here. Next up for Caramoan, and this one's kind of a tough one just because, like, again, like, I don't think anyone is particularly likely. Like, I think Dawn versus Brendo would have been humorous to see immediately after this, though also it's like I don't think they were particularly happy with Brenda for most of the season, to where I don't know if they would have really wanted to bring her back. And again, I don't think many options here lead to both people saying yes, especially all the options that were actually kind of realistic. So I did end up going with Malcolm and Andrea here, where again, do I think they were actually going to say yes immediately afterwards? No. I mean, we do know Malcolm was asked for Blood versus Water and turned that down, but still, I think Malcolm versus Andrea, that seems like kind of a pairing I could see them putting together, so I did go with that here. Next up for Blood versus Water, and really I think this is between three people. You got Hayden, Sierra, Vetus. I think those were three people that were most likely to return. However, you do also have Brad Culpepper and also John Cody, who are likely returnees as well. And I think Brad versus John would have been a decent pairing as well. Though really, I think I'm going to limit it to those three. The question is, which pairing actually ends up on the season? I think the least likely is Sierra versus Vetus. While these are the two people that later returned for Cambodia, I think these are the two that have the least connection to be brought back together. I mean, Hayden versus Sierra is a pairing that, again, they were working together towards the end of Hayden's game, while Vetus versus Hayden are, again, a pairing that was working together at one point but then broke apart. I think I lean towards Hayden and Sierra. I think Sierra was the most likely returnee of this bunch, while Hayden was also particularly liked at the time, so again, that is the route I went. Next up for Survivor Cagayan, and I mean, while you can say, okay, Tony versus Sarah would have been a very interesting dynamic, and they literally did do this for Game Changers, I have no doubt the pick actually would have been Cass versus Spencer. Yeah, I think this was a rivalry that was really hyped up at the time. I mean, they genuinely did not get along, and we do see them being brought back immediately for Cambodia. I feel like Cass versus Spencer is the one that makes the most sense to me. Next up, moving on to San Juan del Sur, and I think this is another one that has a super obvious answer, where obviously it's Josh and Jeremy, these two big rival figures coming into the merge that went out back to back. I feel like this is the obvious answer, to where really, I don't even think there's another true option. Maybe you could say Keith, especially if they can't get Josh, to do Jeremy versus Keith, who had like a semblance of a rivalry, though I think Josh and Jeremy is like the very clear storyline coming out of this season, to where they would have been the picks. Next up for Worlds Apart, and this one's a bit weird because obviously the returnees that we end up seeing for the next season end up being Joe and Shireen. However, Joe and Shireen don't really have much of a connection to each other, to where I do feel like that would have been a random pairing. However, outside of that, the people that were also up for grabs in Cambodia were Max, Carolyn, and Mike, where straight up within all this, I think Joe is the most locked in player on the board. I think he is 100% coming back for next season. So at that point, it's more so a debate of who goes next to Joe. Like, while the Max and Shireen pairing could have been a possibility, I don't think that was going to happen, as again, I think they would have went with Joe instead. I don't think Joe and Carolyn have that much of a connection, so I am going to go with Joe and Mike. Well, again, Mike and Carolyn could have been an option here. I just feel like Joe and Mike are both similar enough, being these two like challenge beasts, and Mike at the time was also extremely popular, to where I feel like these are the two that I see most likely coming back. Next up, for Survivor Cambodia, this is also a very difficult one, as again, I don't think many people would have been willing to play again right away. Now, I think the most realistic option here would have been someone like Varner and Terry, where Varner obviously does come back almost immediately afterwards, while Terry obviously got taken out of the game, and I think it would have been nice to give him another chance. Sierra obviously comes back for Game Changers, though I don't really see a true path to her getting picked here. However, I do think the option they would have wanted over anything would have been Joe and Kelly. I think they would have wanted both of these players back. I think coming out of Cambodia, they kind of end up being the poster child for Survivor at that point, being the two like most likely people to be named as who you're most like by future players in their bios. Like, I do feel like Joe and Kelly were really popular at the time, so I feel like they would have wanted to get them. However, I don't think they could have gotten either of them, considering I believe they were both in the running for Game Changers and both declined. Obviously, they do later come back for Edge of Extinction together, but to be honest, I don't think they would have gone for this season, but I decided to pick them anyway. Next for KAOH, and this is obviously interesting considering we do see some of these people come back for Game Changers immediately afterwards, where that pool ends up being Caleb, Ty, Aubrey, and Debbie, and I do think there's interesting combinations within that. You have Ty and Aubrey, who got to the end together. You got Aubrey versus Debbie, which is this big rivalry. You got Caleb versus Ty, who are this really interesting friendship. And I think you can also consider the medevac route of going Caleb versus Neil. I personally here went with Caleb versus Ty. Not that this is the option that I personally actually would have liked, as in that case, I probably would have went Ty and Aubrey or Aubrey and Debbie, though realistically, I think Ty and Caleb is the option that they would have went with. I mean, at the time, they were so high on Caleb, talking about him as a locked returnee. I think pairing up with Ty just makes all the sense in the world, so I think that is the route they would have went with. Next up, for Millennials versus Gen X, I think this one's kind of easy, though it kind of goes against what ended up actually happening, where obviously we see Zeke and Michaela later come back for Game Changers. However, I think that's a situation where they just had these random 2 returnee slots on a grander returnee season. I think if we're doing a full-blown returnee captain season, I do think they go a different route there. Now, I think Zeke and Michaela will still be in the running. I do think Michaela probably would have been paired up with Jay instead. I think that could have been an interesting combo. I also think Jay could have been paired up with Adam. I think that could have been an interesting combo. Though really the route that I think they would have taken is Zeke and David. I think Zeke would have been there for sure. I think they love Zeke at the time. And David, I think, is the easy person to pair him up with. Another person they loved, another person they wanted to see play again. Now, I don't know if David would have wanted to play again, but I do think this is the rivalry of the season that really stands out, to where I feel like they make perfect returnee captains here. Next up for Game Changers, and here I think there's a couple interesting pairings. You got like something like a Brad and Ty, you got a Tony and Sandra. However, I don't think either of these were particularly realistic for immediately after the season. Where the option I'm going to go with here will seem a bit random, though it's actually probably what I personally would have liked to see, and that is Suri versus Malcolm. Now, what do Suri and Malcolm have connecting each other together? Absolutely nothing, but they were both the players I think got the most screwed on this season. Sri obviously with Advantage Geddon, and Malcolm obviously with that really wonky joint tribal, to where I think these are two players that I personally would have liked to see back from this season, so screw it, I'm going with them. Next up for HHH, and I think this one's kind of easy. I think there's only one true rivalry that really sticks out as people that you would bring back for a future season, and that is Ben and Chrissy. Obviously Ben was a pretty big lock for a returnee season at this point, and Chrissy was also very well liked by production, so I think their rivalry would have been a very easy pick here for a returnee captain season, so I went with them. Next up for Ghost Island, and here I think this one's super easy as well, where I'm going with Dom and Wendell. Now obviously I have talked about these other pairings in the past of these duos that get to the end, and I did not pick those for the later returnee captain seasons, namely like a JT and Steven, a Parvati and Amanda. However, I think this one's very different in the fact that it is this duo, but there is also this sort of rivalry between the two where, again, do I actually think they're going to work against each other? No, but they did end up getting in a tied vote, which I think is a situation that production would really love to hype up. And also, I think unlike particularly the JT and Steven situation, I don't think there's another locked returnee from this season in the way that Coach was on Tocantins to kind of take their spots. Now, I will say I did also consider the Dominic and Chris rivalry as one to bring back. However, I never really got the sense they liked Chris, so I felt like Dom and Wendell just felt like the obvious pick here. Next up for Survivor, David versus Goliath. Here again, there are a couple options here, with me realizing essentially that they all revolve around Christian. At the time, Christian was obviously a massive character. I think he was a very likely returnee if he wanted to come back. However, there were three options to pair him up with. I think there's Angelina, who at the time was also a very likely returnee, one that Jeff Probst himself said that he would have liked to see back over anyone else from the cast. Also, you got Davey, who is also a likely returnee and probably at least has more connection to Christian in terms of having a returnee storyline. And the same thing with Gabby, where I think this probably would have been the most interesting from a pure storyline standpoint. Though realistically, I think they would have just went with Angelina. I think they really want both Christian and Angelina back, and I think that would have been the option they went with, even though I do think the Christian Gabby one would have been more interesting for the storytelling of the season. Next up for Edge of Extinction, and I mean, there's no real other option. We're going with Chris and Rick, where obviously they would have wanted Rick Devens back at the time, and to me, it's like the only other pairing that seems to make sense is him and Chris. Obviously, Chris causes the end of Rick's game, and I think that would have been the choice that they went with here. Now, realistically, I think there are other returnee options for sure. However, I think when we're basing this all around Rick Devens and thinking of like who they would have paired him up with, I do feel like Chris is the one that makes sense. So while Chris on his own right isn't the most likely returnee, I feel like pairing him up with Devens just makes sense. So I went with that here. Next up for IOI, and this one I think has two big options here. I think you can go the rivalry route with Nora versus Lauren, which I think probably would have been the more interesting storyline for me personally, or you can go the two fan favorite route, which I think that is probably the route they would have taken, especially after IOI having a lot of negativity surrounding it. I think they would have gone with Elaine and Janet being the two fan favorites of the season, with at the time Elaine being this massive favorite from Jeff. And I think pairing her up with Janet just kind of makes sense, especially considering how well liked Janet was due to her handling of the Dan Spilo situation and people talking about how screwed she was with the auto nullifier. So okay, I feel like these are the two options here. Next up for Winners at War, and again, there's not really a point even doing this. They would never bring back two people from Winners at War immediately after the season, though I think the two people that would have been the most likely to return were probably just going to be the two finalists in Natalie versus Michelle. Now, these are two people that we've obviously seen on reality TV since then, both of which doing the challenge, both of which have been very open about talking about being willing to play again since the season, and I just think in general are two of the most likely returnees from this season at this point anyway, so again, I did go with that route here. Next up for Survivor 41, and there's no other option here in my mind. It's Shan and Ricard. Really, for me, it's like this is the definitive answer. Like, there's no other option here. It's like you got to pick Shan and Ricard. These two that obviously worked together for a lot of the season, though these two that turned into rivals that grew to not like each other after the season, that also are two of the better players from the season. Like, to me, it's like there's no other option here. It's like they are the obvious answer. Next up for Survivor 42, and this one's a bit more all over the place. I think there's a lot of returnees that you can get from the season. How the matchups here are a bit wonky, where you do have a few rivalries that you can pick up here. Something like a Mike versus High. You can get Mike versus Omer, Drea versus Omer, which, I mean, I don't think they would have gone that route. Jonathan versus Lindsay seems like a probable outcome. However, the route I went with is picking Jonathan and Omer, where they openly talk about on this season that they represent different aspects of the game, with Omer being the strategic player and Jonathan being the physical player. And I feel like that is something you can clearly set up from the very beginning to distinguish the two captains, while two also having a very complex relationship of them working together for a lot of it, only for Omer to turn on Jonathan and Jonathan to then eventually outplay Omer by the end. And like, I just think overall, this is probably the most interesting dynamic to bring back here, so I went with them. Now for 43, and this one I think is kind of obvious as well. I do think you got to bring back Jesse and Cody, who are, again, similar case, very complex relationship. Jesse had just made this massive move against Cody, and both of which are pretty big fan favorites from this season, to where I just feel like they're the obvious choice to bring back here. Now I would have also considered Carla for this, and I think Carla versus Jesse probably would have been fine, though I think production for sure would have wanted to bring back this Cody versus Jesse dynamic instead, so that is the route I went with here. Now for Survivor 44, which was actually kind of a difficult one here, as I feel like there's just so many combinations to work with. Easy answer would have been the return of Bruce, to where at that point, I guess you pair him up with Matthew as the other medevac, where obviously this would have made sense considering Bruce's return for 45. However, I actually decided to not go this route, as I really don't feel like from production standpoint they look at Bruce as much as a returnee, as much as just a guy that didn't really get a chance the first time, and now they're giving him his first chance. So I decided to leave Bruce off of this, to where at that point, again, there's still a couple other options to go with. I mean, I could have gone Matt versus Franny, which would have been humorous. Have this dating couple have to go against each other. But I do feel like at the end of the day, you have to narrow it down to the Ticas. Again, Survivor 44 was all based around the Ticas. And through that, again, you have all these combinations. You have Jam Jam and Carolyn, which would make a lot of sense. Jam Jam and Carson, which probably makes a little bit less sense. The option I personally went with here is Carolyn and Carson. And the reason I went with this one over the combinations with Jam Jam is because, again, Jam Jam had obviously just won last season. Through that, I feel like for a season like this, they're probably more inclined to pick a non-winner if they can. And through that, I feel like this is the route they would go with. Obviously, Carolyn is a massive lock on the board for a returnee season, and I feel like Carson, again, just feels more in line with who you would pick for a captaincy in particular over Jam Jam. So again, that's the route I went with here. With that is every season of Survivor, talking about what if every season was a returnee captain season. So obviously down the road, expect more Survivor what ifs, top 10s, whatever else I decide to do. I somehow still have more ideas that I would like to get to at some point down the road, but for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.